tell me about yourself. How did you get to a place where you were going to make a documentary about the embarrassment? Are you from Kansas?
I am from Kansas. I grew up there. I spent my formative years there. I mean, I was born in the Northeast, and so in Connecticut, not too far from New York. So I spent a lot of time there growing up. So I had seen the world outside of flyover country, right? But
right.
Like grade school age, I grew up in Kansas, in Wichita. And
all right. Well, you should also know that I have family in Wichita, and I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. So I'm actually of that stripe, or at least I know those stripes. But I love the way in your movie that Kansas is kind of a state of mind.
Yeah, it's absolutely a character in the movie. And we talked a lot about that as we're making, kind of exaggerating it.
Right.
Not just because it is an essential part of their story as a band, but because it's a way in from like a filmmaking perspective, like a narrative perspective. It's a way in for people not familiar with the band, people not from Kansas, because we really wanted this to not just be a love letter to the band. There had to be something else to it, something that made it accessible for people who are from around here, from people that are not familiar with post-punk in general. So that was really kind of the biggest thing that we had to figure out when we were making it. But I guess I should back up to tell you more. Yeah. I should answer your original question. So I was growing up in Wichita from the time I was like in grade school, and I had grown up in a family of movie fans, of cinephiles, my brothers and I, and just like in the movie, just like as we often see with people that get into this stuff, there's always like an older brother, and I'm the middle child, so it was my older brother who was introducing stuff to me, and around high school, so I was probably like 15, around 2000, 2001, when the New York, rock rebirth thing was happening with, bands like The Strokes, The Walkmen, Interpol, Ted Leo and the Pharmacist, that kind of thing. And it was through that I found out about bands like, all the greats like Velvet Underground and The Clash and the Ramones and all that. And my older brother, who had been working at a local art museum, he's like a teenager himself, and he started hanging out with all these guys who were like, much older than him, like the film programmer at this museum. This guy's name is Jake, and he was part of the band's circle, the Embarrassment circle back in the early 80s. He was pretty young then too, but so it was through him that we're finding out about all these bands. I'm having this like really before and after moment in my life where it's like everything else, like I will never be able to focus on anything else or measure myself in any way other than through movies and rock music and stuff. And so thrown into this mix of all these great bands is one of their compilation albums. I think it was probably Heyday or Retrospective. And it was like, what the hell is this? Like, how is this even possible? These guys sound like from the same era because of the DIY nature of their recordings. But also this photo of them. In the photos in the film, it's by one of the two photographers that followed them around. His name is Mike Pfizer. But it's this black and white photo of them hanging out in their practice and performance space with Flatiron. And they had this look to them where they weren't looking goofy. They were looking kind of serious. And the thing kind of had like an eerie feel to me. Like, how could this be from here, and how could we all not know about this? So it was that, it was pretty clear right away that there was something more to this band that had to be figured out. And if I ever did, get serious about filmmaking, that this movie didn't exist, then it would just have to be made at some point.
Cool. So I'm just guessing that you're not at the age where you ever saw them live.
No, I was born in '86. So they had broken up by the time I came along. But I did when I was in college at KU is when my future collaborator, Dan Fetherston, had started his early version. And those interviews are what sparked their 2006 reunion shows. And so my brother made sure that I came back from Lawrence to Wichita to catch their reunion show there. So I was at that show when I was like 19. And I didn't know, but Featherston was there shooting it, and we ended up recording or editing that footage, just last year. So.
Okay, good. So you didn't see them until you were 19, and by the point when you saw them, you knew the repertoire, and you knew, when they were going to lean into a certain song, et cetera. You recognized stuff as it started to roll by.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was waiting for my favorites, but I didn't know them nearly as intimately as I do now. But I definitely remember that show.
So when did you know? I mean, it sounds like that maybe was the moment when you figured out, oh, we've got a documentary here. Tell me about meeting your collaborator and what he was doing and how you guys hooked up.
Well, it was really that feeling that never went away, that just sort of became more and more solidified as I started, as I started watching other music documentaries and stuff. I knew that this thing was just waiting, and it wasn't. I started messing around with cameras in my 20s when I lived in New York. I moved to New York for a while, started just messing around there. I was living in New Orleans, and I finally decided, like, all right, it's time to do this thing. And so I called up their manager from back in the day, Dan Rouser, who sort of a family friend, and I told him, like, someone's got to do this, and I think it'll be me. And he said, well, hold up there, because somebody already did try, and that's Dan Fetherston. And you might think that would be sort of disappointing. Like, if I think that, like, someone's got to do this and no one else is in a better spot to do it than I am, some people might think it would be disappointing to find out that somebody had already started on that idea. But really, for me, it actually was sort of reaffirming, like, that this endeavor was worth embarking on. Because, like, I knew that the whole point of this band was that not many people had heard of them. They never got very big, and they never broke through to mainstream success. But because of that age I was at when I discovered them, like a really impressionable age where it feels like everybody sort of knows something that you don't, and I got to figure it out. I had this idea that, like, if you walked into any music store, like, locally owned music store across the country, then if you said the Embarrassment, that they'd be sort of like, oh, I know who you're talking about. And so but at the same time, I knew that probably wasn't true. And so there was always a suspicion, like, I know this has to be done and that it's worth it, that there's something to this band. But I also don't know if, like, how many people are actually waiting for it. And so when I found out that this guy from New York had already started, it was like, it confirmed it. It was like, okay, this is worth it. So I'm going to try to do my own thing for a bit. And I don't want him to think I'm interfering. But it only took about 2 years of shooting my own interviews and doing my own research where I was like, all right, I don't think maybe it'll help him get finished, and maybe it'll help me actually get somewhere here, because I'm not going to be able to travel around and do all the interviews that he did back in 05 and 06. So I gave him a call in, like, 2019, and we went from there.
So tell me, as you're making your way through this story, you're meeting other musicians who they've influenced, and I'm curious of telling me, like, what your favorite stories are. Running into someone, I don't know, from the Strokes, from any of the bands you've mentioned or haven't mentioned so far. Like, who did you find that were like, oh yeah, they lit up over the Embarrassment?
Well, if we had a fan that from a band at that level, they would have shown up in the film. But so we didn't. I don't know if there's anybody surprising along the way, but as you saw, we got Evan Dando in the film, and so that was probably the biggest name. And I wish Dan were here too. I don't want to steal his thunder on that story, but because he was the one that interviewed him before a show at Irving Plaza in New York. I think it was November 2021. But he's got this hilarious story about. We'll just say that Dando like lived up to his reputation of being like very, very, very sweet and charming, but also maybe a little hazy about the details. But no, he was great. He was a fan he knew Bill Goffrey from the Embarrassment from his Big Dipper days in the Boston area. And so it was like 10 years, like a decade after the Embarrassment's heyday. But he heard them playing on local radio in Boston, and he immediately became a fan. So other than Dan, though, I mean, Freddie Johnston is like the other.
That's right, Freddie Johnston and Grant Hart. You got Grant Hart from Husker Du.
Grant Hart was a great another coincidence from 2006 interviews with Fetherston. He just happened to be playing a show in Lawrence the night that the Embarrassment were doing their reunion show there. So they met up, and the drummer asked Grant, like, right before the show, he's like, hey, do you want to come introduce us? So when we were editing all this reunion footage last year, he starts he starts the movie. But so I think that interview took place backstage before that show.
Well, you should know. So I covered. I'm friendly with a couple Big Dipper fans, and I knew Bill during that Boston era, and I covered Big Dipper for the Phoenix. I was the club columnist for them back in the day. And so that my pathway to the Embarrassment was actually meeting Bill and hearing from Gary Wallach, oh, you have to check out Bill's other band and stuff like that. So that's my port of entry.
Yeah, I mean, Bill's great. I mean, this stuff wouldn't have happened. This movie never would have happened if Bill, especially, but really all the guys hadn't been so gracious over the years.
Right. Well, and I want to talk about that. Bill, let's talk about Bill for a second, because obviously he's gone on to do some very interesting things. I follow him on Instagram, and he's now I am so impressed with that guy's paintings. I mean, the guy just he's killing it on the canvas. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable. And then I was impressed all over again with what a wonderful guitar player he is. I mean, for so much of it, I did not understand until I saw the movie how much of this band was trio based, right? That the second guitar was added, and a lot of the stuff that I'd fallen in love with was really guitar trio.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, he's I noticed that at some point too. Like Don Juan, one of their perhaps their best song. I don't know if I can give that title to any song, but yeah, there's that second guitar in it where it's like that's when they had crossed over into like their great like studio. That when everything really came alive. But no, a lot of it was just started with Bill, and like being pressed on by Brent. There's that great line in the movie where he says like, Bill kept telling me, play more, and it's like that's where this fast pace, like where the frenetic energy comes from.
Right.
But no, Bill's like, I mean, it's the painting, it's the guitar playing. And he was like a little filmmaker too. It's like in his like preteen and teenage years. That's one of the moments you asked earlier about when I realized that there was something worthy of a movie that could do the band justice. And it's when Fetherston and I started sharing footage, and I saw all of that Super 8 stuff from when Bill was a teenager and younger. And it's like, holy shit, like this guy's like, it's like some really striking visuals, and like this guy's
very striking. No, it's a fascinating thing to sort of put visuals with the music, because the music, I don't know, for the longest time, so I never saw him, but the music, I'm so in love with the music, and of course I have my own visual ideas about what's going on, and then you see them playing, and it just is a totally different thing. It's one of the strongest juxtapositions of what getting introduced to a visual of a band long after you have sort of internalized all the sounds. I found that very jarring and very interesting. I want to go back and watch the film again, because I'm still putting the pieces together in my head. Yeah,
I think I feel like I have a similar reaction. I'm still trying to put all the pieces together, but it's that mystery that sort of sparked the entire thing. It was like trying to figure out how these guys could create that sound, and I think it ends up being a little bit more implicit rather than explicit in the movie, because I think that's a lot of people ask that question, like how could this sound come from these guys? And I think that was one of the biggest challenges, like for this thing, was like how directly do we answer that question? And a lot of it comes down to Thomas Frank, which was another, like you asked to answer your question about when I thought we had something worthy of the band.
Sure.
It was that interview with Thomas Frank was a big turning point, because we needed that person who's not only like, incredibly engaging to listen to and eloquent and a great interview, which he's all those things, but also somebody to put that context in this, like, the post-punk context, like a historian, to explain like what was happening in the world and the country when this band came along. But it's through his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, where he quotes Sex Drive. I mean, there's a reason he mentions them, and it's because that whole book is about red state myth. It's about debunking this idea that people in flyover country are just like boring and usual and the real, country folk of like the real Americans. When of course that's not true. It's just people, right? Like certainly it's less concentrated. Like there's like the population, like its density is much lower, but it's just people. It's a myth that talent doesn't exist here like it would in other places. The amount, like it just doesn't have the amount of people, and therefore it doesn't have the infrastructure to support it. And so and I think it becomes evident just by watching these guys. Like there's no magic that made these guys like form a band. Like sure they had access to records and to film and TV and all the other pop culture influences that they turned into their songs, but they're just people. And unlike other people, imagine all the bands around across the past few decades that maybe got together a few times but then fizzled out because the industry wasn't there to support it and didn't seem realistic. But these guys stuck to it. They were like, no, we're going to do it anyway because we're as good, and we're going to do it from Wichita. And we're gonna set up video, like we're gonna filmmakers to come here and shoot us so that we can send that out because we know where the industry is going. And so all these relics of that time exist, and they really made a go of it more than most other people would have from this part of the country.
Definitely, there's a lot I want to unpack from that. So number one, what I'm thinking is, what I think the movie accomplishes really well is the period. Because it's hard for us to imagine right now we're steeped in the web, but it was everything you're saying, but multiplied by a factor that's very hard to persuade younger listeners how detached and remote all of that seemed, right? So these distant regions were distant not just geographically, but psychically and also just electronically. Like you had to pay money to call Kansas back in 1978. I mean, there were severe limitations placed on the infrastructure of bands coming out of places like that. And so a big piece of their heroic stature comes from their just being like, well, we're just going to do it. It doesn't, we don't care whether people pay attention to us, right? Which was a big piece of the punk ethic. And that comes through, loud and clear in the movie. I think it's really well done.
Yeah, that detachment is key. I love that about you have to pay to talk to these people. I mean, that, that context is essential for their story. I mean, it's an obvious challenge to like breaking through to mainstream success, but that isolation, I think, is also Dan Rouser, their manager, talks a lot about that during our interviews. Like, it's what led to their originality. Like, you're detached, and so you're going to limit yourself, in terms of like financial success and all those connections. But you're also free to do whatever the hell you want to do, and you're not influenced by whatever the trends are, whatever the fashion is, and the other styles and everything. So I think it's. But I know I love what you said about it. It's hard to put into words people today because we're so connected today, despite geography. Like the internet connects everybody in a way that that really didn't exist just a few decades ago.
Right. Well, and then there's that documentary that you use. You intercut the interviews and the live footage with, what looks like a mid-'60s documentary about, like the Chamber of Commerce, Kansas idea of itself. For contrast, and I want you to talk a little bit about where you found that and why you used that.
Yeah, so that, Center City, USA. It's actually two. One of them is from the early 70s, I think. That's Center City, USA. And the other one is from the mid-'60s, I believe, and that's called Wichita Now. And those had shown up on YouTube, and, it's like great Mad Men era version of Wichita.
Right.
It's just like, I think when we talk to somebody from the library, the Kansas Public Library, it's like the story was that somebody had just found it on a dusty shelf somewhere and had it transferred onto tape, and that's what was put onto YouTube. But it's just, I love the idea of contrasting that with their sound, because that's what they were growing up in, and it really helped build this character of the antagonist in the movie, really, which is like the conformity of everything that surrounded them, everything that Brent talks about, never wanting to be part of, which was just joining an aircraft company and
right.
just doing that. That exists everywhere. Like anywhere that's not actually in a big city, you just go an hour or so north of New York, or just go into Pennsylvania or something, and things start to feel pretty similar. But it's heightened in Kansas because of the distance, right? Because it's just there's just more and more farmland and hours in between one city to the next. And really, it's heightened because of the myth of Kansas, with the Wizard of Oz and everything. And so I think that was really important for creating that character, that antagonist of Kansas, that conformity, and serving as one of those entry points for outside audiences.
So was there any footage that didn't make the film that breaks your heart that it's not in there?
When it comes to video footage, there was certainly a time where Dan and I both wondered, is this enough? It's really, it's because it didn't seem like enough, but it turns out that compared to a lot of bands from that era, it's plenty. We don't even use, we cut it together in ways that hasn't been seen before, but we use pretty much every source, every show that exists of them.
Right.
And so there's not one show that we had to cut that keeps me up at night, but there are things that I think exist that we could have gotten that I'll probably never stop thinking about. One of them is pretty much everybody involved was really supportive and really gracious and helping out in any way possible. But the guy in Wichita who shot that couch interview and the music videos of I'm in Don Juan and Don't Choose the Wrong Song, that it was more difficult getting in touch with him and figuring out if he had any whatever was on his cutting room floor. That's what I think we would have loved to have was outtakes from them being interviewed or outtakes from those music videos. So that would have been amazing. I mean, the ending, I hate when people, I don't want to spoil anything, but then again, people probably, I don't know if anything can be spoiled in this movie because it's in the title. But I'm thinking about the ending when they close, when they play that great song by perhaps the most successful artist of that time. There was a moment where we weren't sure if we're going to be able to end the movie with that for copyright reasons, and it ended up working out. And so there was a moment where we had an alternate ending plan, and I think that probably would have kept us up at night for the rest of our lives. But thank God it ended up being okay, because it ended up being the perfect message, I think, to end the movie with.
Well, I just want to say I love that ending, and I love how majestic and embracing and huge they sound. And then you get the visual and you pan to the audience, and there's 16 people in me.
That's the key, right?
It's just a phenomenal image, because I think they're playing their hearts out, and it's it's like a rooftop concert for this Kansas band, right? But first of all, I was taken aback to realize, they're playing live. This is a live set. To me, it sounds so beautifully orchestrated. Not careful, but just, it's got great spark to it, and it sounds beautifully recorded. And then you look at it, it's that can't be that beautifully recorded. What is happening? Who recorded that?
Yeah,
it's just unbelievable. And then it took me a while to recognize the tune. And then once I recognized the tune, I thought, oh my God. So it's a triple layer of whoa, this is a real reality distortion field happening here.
Hell yeah. That's exactly it. It's that always has been one of their best songs, right? And so but it's this thing where it was we play up the originality of that, and how authentic and original, they write their own stuff, all that. And so for a while I was wondering, okay, so but to end it with a cover, is there what exactly are we? But then
well, no,
the thing is, yeah, but it's
I'm sorry, keep going.
it's wholly theirs, right? Like, it may be a cover, but it takes you a while to realize it. And it is them at like the height of their powers, like turning something that exists, like taking what was financially successful of that era and doing it in maybe a better way. And so,
well, right. It's right. It's like, I mean, as a critic, I just have to say I'm passionate about that moment because it's music criticism. it's commentary on, we have developed such an original angle on things. We can do this, and it sounds completely original, right? Like the reference is it's only gonna hit you maybe halfway through. I just think that's just this tremendous artistry going on there.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I love to hear that as a landing in that way. And like you said, that's exactly right. The camera pans out and there's nobody there. Like this amazing thing is happening, and you've got like a kid and a couple of other people dancing.
Well,
around.
right, and you realize that it's a neighborhood, and it's like these people are intimate and they know this band. Like some of them are just there just for the social end, not even the music end. Like it just is. Just this, the informality of it is really, really, it's astonishing. It's a real exclamation point. It's a real beautiful way to end.
Yeah, there was this moment where, so we're like in the middle of editing, probably our most intense like editing stretch. I've got my parts, Dan's doing his parts, and I'm like, sort of thinking, like, I know that it's both of our, like Dan said that song was what he would play like when he was younger and he had parties late at night. He'd like, at like 2 a.m. he'd break out like, hey, let me show you something. And I like always knew that it was probably one of their most like one of their most driving songs, like one of those fun songs to listen to. So I'm wondering, but we hadn't talked about it. And so one day I'm like, are we going to use that? And Dan's like, I think we gotta. I think we got an idea for it. So yeah, I think it ended up being the ideal ending, and it would have been a real bummer to lose it. But the reason it stayed, the reason it's okay, is because of everything that you're describing, how they really make it their own, and it becomes a piece of criticism, just like you said. That's the key, is that it's actually saying something new.
Totally. All right. So, for the gearheads out there, talk to us about your process. What kinds of format you came across? What kinds of reformatting you had to do? What was your sweet spot in terms of like your cutting suite, software, etc.? Just geek out for a couple minutes for us.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Dan and I are always like, I wonder if someone's going to ask about. That editing, because that's where the movie is really made. But
sure.
I mean, that's one of the things that was really one of the most like surprising and fortunate things for me was I was out there for a couple of years just sort of doing my own thing in my DSLR and trying to come up with I don't know if I was going to do a short that maybe just focused on the house wrecking party or something like that. But when I realized that if this was ever going to be like the definitive documentary about the band, that I would have to get in touch with the guy who had all this footage already. And because he hadn't abandoned it, he had just it had stalled, and he had at one point handed off all this footage to an editor in the New York area who's credited. His name's Rich Martins, and he had migrated everything into Avid, Avid Media Composer, and organized everything. And then he had come back with he messed around with the footage a little bit. And around the time I got in touch with Dan, summer 2019, is when he had gotten the footage back from Rich. And so when it came time to share everything with me, and really the two of us start working in earnest together in editing, it was all set up and ready to go in Avid. So everything had been transferred. Everything's pretty much. There's some hiccups in terms of making sure that I could view the same sequence that he could view. But that's really sort of the wonder of technology, of the digital technology right now. The idea that all this could be done without us ever meeting in the same room. I mean, I don't know if that's clear in some of the articles that have already been written, but like Dan and I didn't meet face to face until an hour before the premiere last fall.
Yeah. No, that's the modern world, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like Frank Sinatra duetting with people without being in the same room.
Yeah. So it's a pandemic project for sure. It made the whole thing possible. But no, so like so as far as editing and Avid, that was all ready to go. But as far as like, a lot of their stuff existed only on like Betamax tapes, and but it had been transferred by people that are close to the band. Joel Sanderson's a guy who sort of had documented it and or digitized as much as possible he could. So a lot of that was online, but really a lot of it had been done by Jim Rosencutter, who was their sound guy, who was, in one of the early versions of the band, who shows up a lot in the movie. He had transferred done the digital transfer of the Flatiron footage years ago. So, a lot of that stuff had already been done. I mean, I had found some old Betamax tapes that I tried to transfer, but ended up not being stored properly. So, but then some of it, we tracked down some old VHS footage and get that transferred and use that as some of the B-roll. So there was some fun like discoveries there. But
and are you a Final Cut Pro person or are you a Premiere person? What's your?
I've worked in a little bit in everything. I'd been doing Premiere before we started on this, and Dan is definitely a Premiere guy. So a lot of its final touch-ups were done in Premiere. But as far as like the real work, the real editing stuff, where this whole movie was crafted, that was all done in Avid Media Composer.
In Avid, okay. And what is the takeaway that you hope most people get from watching this documentary? What's your goal for like your key audience experience?
Well, from the very beginning, I really didn't have many expectations in terms of like screening at festivals, getting it picked up by a distributor or anything like that. So all of that has just been like really a great surprise. But for me, I was like, if this is just a Wichita thing and it's something that gets shown or aired on the local, PBS station or something, and somebody who's like, the same age I was when I found out about them, watches this and has the same sort of revelation or feeling of inspiration that I did when I was that age. Like, when the first time I saw No Direction Home, Scorsese's great, the Bob Dylan documentary.
Mm-hmm.
And they realize that there's this whole scene, there's this whole era of music that they just, that seems sort of impossible, but they never really knew about before. That was always sort of my goal, was like, if I can just get this thing made and have it be discovered by somebody down the line, to me that would be great. But, for everything I said earlier about the answer to that question, like, how could this come from here? Like,
right.
I think, I hope that that's a takeaway. I don't think it's spelled out explicitly in the movie, but it's something that I realized at some point. As mystifying as everything continues to be in some ways, I think that idea of Thomas Frank and sort of dispelling that myth of that mid-state, red state myth of flyover country and the lack of talent or inspiration in this part of the country. I think that's got to be a takeaway.
Totally, I agree with you. Well, I meant to say earlier about Thomas Frank, what I love about the movie is how it gives me new ideas about his work too. Like for me, it reframes the figure of Thomas Frank and the voice of Thomas Frank. So I love that, because that book is really, just an eye opener. His work is always really eye opening. So I agree with you. What a great interview that is. Yeah. So give me your top three favorite rock documentaries. They don't have to be models, but like, things that made you feel like No Direction Home. Yeah.
Well, so for me, that was, I saw that when I was in college, just a few years after I found out about the band. And so to me, that's always just sort of been like what I look to as the the pinnacle for music docs. And then when Rolling Thunder Review came out in 2019, that was really what pushed me over the edge to finally call Dan and be like, all right, let's make this happen for sure. Because that thing was like, I mean, I was such a fan of No Direction Home from college age, and I remember thinking, like, I can't wait until Scorsese makes something else like this, like a sequel, or whether it's about Dylan or somebody else. And, you know, like, he made one about the Rolling Stones, but it was like a sort of like a concert film when they were older. And then he had the George Harrison one at some point, but I had gone through my Beatles phase, and so I don't even know, it didn't really hit the same way. So when Rolling Thunder came out, it was like, it really felt like a sequel. It was like, it hit me really hard. And it was like, holy shit, I forgot that I was waiting for this. But it really kind of like kicked my ass and put this thing in gear. And so I would kind of count those as the same. But the Velvet Underground, you know, Todd Haynes' documentary that came out last year, we were really just about, we were in the middle of editing still. So we had a lot of conversations about that. And I think, because even though, like, it's wholly, like, when it comes to, like, fame and influence, I'd say Velvet Underground's on a wholly different level than the Embarrassment. But there's a trajectory of their story that sort of mirrors this, you know, the Embarrassment in terms of, like, small following. They kind of did their couple things and then fizzled out, and a lot of people, you know, don't know about them. So to take in that while we were editing, I think was an important thing.
Right.
But then we also ended up watching the George Harrison one, and we took a lot from that. Another one that we watched, you know, that I watched while editing was there's this one on Netflix about Nina Simone called What Happened, Miss Simone, and I think it really nails the kind of opening that I wanted to try to aim for with ours, which is just like this sort of like, you just sort of give the subject, or like the artist, so you sort of put it out there and let it, you know, just let the tape roll and let the audience get familiar and really like see what they were about at their height and sort of work backwards from there to we're kind of stunned at the very beginning. So, so those, I mean, we watched a bunch. The big one for Dan was, the Minutemen documentary with Jay McConnell. Oh, that was his original inspiration when he first started. It's what made him want to do this. And that one's like a really down and dirty, like, you know, riding in the side of a car with those guys. But it really ends up feeling like the sound of the band, and that's why that's the original.
I just came across Mike Watt playing in a trio with Jim Keltner. Have you heard this? Oh, it's amazing. Especially their second record. It's a guitar player. I could go look it up, but if you search for Mike Watt and Jim Keltner's 80. But it's a jazz guitarist, and it's just flaming. And it's like, who would have thought you would put these guys together? And it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. Sounds great. Check it out. And it's not like what you'd expect Mike Watt to be playing. But apparently the guitarist wrote out his charts for him. Like it's a very planned out thing. Anyway, interesting. Yes, great. I love hearing the references to all of those documentaries. Now, let's finish. Just tell me the story of what's happened since you made it and you had your your Wichita premiere, and update us on the story, what the timetable is for 2023.
Yeah, so we premiered at Wichita last September, and that was, I mean, it was an incredible day. It was like the Friday night gala event. It was out at this big old ornate theater in downtown Wichita, and it was a packed house, and so people were like, you know, cheering at parts that, you know, we didn't really expect, like when the local music store pops up, or a guy the guy that recorded their EP comes on screen, people are cheering. So that was just, we were honestly sort of surreal. We could never imagine such a good premiere. But the band ended up playing afterwards, their first time in like 15 years. So it was like, whoa. It was just like, it was an event. And tell me that you rolled tape. Tell me you rolled tape when they played. Oh yeah, there's videos online, and honestly, actually, Mike Pfizer, they're one of their great photographers. You know, he recorded and shot it from the balcony, and there's a lot of like iPhone video too. So good. So it was a big ask for those guys. Like they were totally into it. They were like ready show in 15 years rather than some sort of small club. They were like in the Orpheum in downtown Wichita, and a lot of space between them and the audience. And it took a little bit, but eventually, I think it was during Wellsville, some fans finally got up and sort of like broke the ice and went to the front of the stage, and people were dancing up front from there. But they're ready to keep going. And then after that, we did a smaller festival in Minneapolis called Sound Unseen last November, which was great because it's a films on music festival. So there's a music and rock theme for pretty much everything they show there. And Minneapolis is such a great music city. So it was amazing being there.
I love the band, and I just was so hoping we'd see something worthy of the band. And I think my initial impressions were kind of like, it was kind of a shock to see a lot of the playing. It was kind of a shock, I have to say. But the more it stayed with me, the more it's really been it's been a great education. It's made me love the band more. So hats off, guys. Great work.
That's great to hear. I mean, something that somebody said during one of the Q&As we had was that it really looked like the band sound, which, when you're starting out and you're just sort of throwing ideas around and trying to pitch it to people, that's sort of like a bullshit thing that you say to try. Sure. It kind of ends up being meaningless. I want it to look like they sound, but so to hear that from somebody when it's all said and done and the whole thing is reality, was a really great compliment. And I think a lot of that was achieved through the editing style and the on-screen lyrics and really just sort of the video footage. It really captures the era, I think. So.
Well, I'm just so glad. Yeah, you got that great early concert. What is it? It's like, I think they're in their space, but it just is very close up. It's not like the best shot stuff, but it's very dramatic, and they're like hitting a different plateau, and then there's a pan out, and you realize they're in this it's a very small space. It's just like this private party that they're playing. My memory is that it's early on in the movie, and it's a pretty dominant piece of tape that you keep coming back to because there's a lot of great material there. But again, it's the contrast of whoa, the sound, and then the context is whoa, they're literally they're doing this for just this private party. I mean, the sound is so authoritative, and the context is so informal, so small scale. I'm searching for neutral terms, right? It's a small town. It's a small scene. It's not a huge scene.
Yeah. That's sort of one of the last lines we hear is the fact that they were content instead of forcing themselves to move to a bigger place like New York, they were content to go back and sort of anchor this the secret world of weirdo new wave shit in the middle of the country.
Right.
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways. It's what do we? Somebody asked once, do you think that it was a hindrance, or do you think that it could have been more successful if they had left? And it's well, I mean, financially, I think it's of course, but if we're talking about success in art. Does every band have to be the Rolling Stones? Is that success to be the Rolling Stones, to be 70 years old and touring? Or is it just as successful to put out an EP and one short album that lives on for decades and isn't is wholly original and authentic to them only? I think it ends up working to their benefit. So
right. Well, that's the punk ethic, right? It's we're serious when we say we don't want to participate in any mainstream values. That's part of it. We're hitching our wagon to that means mainstream success is incidental or Nirvana winds up Nirvana, they really struggled with that.
Yeah, that's something that Thomas Frank loved talking about, was how the entire grunge movement, he wrote a lot about that. He's got this great article that was in Harper's in the 90s where he was out on the road with these bands and talks about how that whole movement was like a commercial imitation of the actual post-punk movement that had happened.
Dan, thank you so much. This has been so great. Great. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.
Okay. See ya.